We're here at the Thinking Matters conference in Auckland, and one of those on stage is Alisa Childers from Tennessee in the USA. She's kindly agreed to have an interview with us, and we're going to talk about the 4 Ds. We're going to talk about the deconstruction of the faith, we're going to talk about Donald Trump and how can Christians vote for him. We're also going to talk about the Democrats and can Christians vote for them. And we're also going to talk about the demise of our culture. So it's the 4 Ds: deconstruction, Donald, Democrats, and demise. So let's go meet Alisa Childers. Alisa, welcome to New Zealand. Is it your first time here?
No, actually, this is, I think, my third time. So I was here when I was about 5, and then when I was about 12 or 13. But this is my first time as an adult.
That's why you think, because you can't remember back
I can't remember.
Okay.
Yeah. But this is the first time I've gotten to come since there has been Lord of the Rings here.
And you're a big fan.
Big fan, yeah.
And the interesting thing is that when I was on Radio Remo, I think we used to play ZOEgirl. You were part of ZOEgirl.
I was,
and I mean, were those, massive days of traveling around the country, even internationally, with ZOEgirl?
A little bit internationally. We didn't do a ton overseas, but it was just constant touring in the States, and it was exhausting. It was a really busy and just all in time. It was just, it was a lot.
So you're in New Zealand because you're part of the Thinking Matters conference. So we love Thinking Matters because I tell you what, I think the culture needs to think more and more, because there seems to be, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but it seems like the culture is set to confuse people and to basically deny anything that is truth. We're in a post-truth culture.
Right.
And so apologetics is becoming even more and more important, isn't it?
It is, and it is in the States too. I think that we are living in a time where people don't even know what the word truth means, and they think truth can be different for each person. And if that's true, then it's very chaotic. It's a chaotic way to live, because then what we should or shouldn't do morally even is a matter of opinion. And if that's true, then it's really just up to the most powerful, and who can exert the most influence that gets to decide what that is. And in history, we've seen that go very, very badly. Yeah.
So just before we get into some of the nitty-gritty topics, and there's some interesting ones. I've entitled them D because I'm keen to talk about deconstruction, Donald. We know Donald. Democrats,
I know
even.
Of one.
Yeah. And even the demise of our culture. So I'm into the Ds for alliteration. But before we do that, I mean, here you are, you're traveling around the world, you're speaking about apologetics. Did you ever think you would be doing this? I mean, did you just fall into this? Did you plan this? How did it come about?
Yeah, no, I never saw this for myself. I always thought music was going to be just my main thing. I just always thought I was going to do music. And what ended up happening is, after ZOEgirl came off the road in about 2008-ish, my husband and I started attending a church in Middle Tennessee, kind of right in the Bible Belt there. Right. And we loved this church. But after we were attending for a while, the pastor invited me to a small class that he said would be like going to seminary. I was very excited about that. What I didn't realize at the time was that pastor had already deconstructed his faith and had become a progressive Christian, but he wasn't really telling his people that on Sunday mornings. And so these little classes that he would have during the week were meant to deconstruct the people in his church. And the reason I know this is because he made a Facebook video kind of saying that's what was going on at that time. And so he was very good at that. He was very good at sort of tearing down what I thought was true and the core beliefs of Christianity. So what that ended up doing for me was, after we left the church, I really was propelled into a faith crisis that brought me to the edge of agnosticism myself. I just didn't know what was real anymore, what was true. As a lifelong Christian, this was incredibly destabilizing and agonizing for me. But God in his faithfulness saw me through that and rebuilt my faith. And apologetics was a huge part of that. Yeah. And so in 2016, I just started a little blog thinking I'll just help maybe some of the old fans of ZOEgirl might be having some faith questions, and maybe they can come to my blog and find some help. And I had no idea that I would end up traveling the world and doing all of this.
Yeah.
So I'm very grateful.
So you've touched on two terms that I think probably for the audience, let's define, because some people may not have heard of them. First was deconstruction, and the second was progressive. How do you define those?
Right, and that's important we define those terms. So deconstruction, in the States, I don't know how it is here, but in the States, if you ask 10 people what deconstruction is, you're going to get 10 different definitions. My co-author says you're going to get 11 different definitions. So for some people, it just means doubting or questioning the things that you were taught as a child. However, when my co-author and I of our deconstruction book did our research, what we realized was that there was something much deeper going on in the deconstruction movement. And so we define it as rethinking your faith, but not regarding scripture as a standard. And it's a postmodern process. So it's sort of rejects this idea that there's this grand meta narrative of reality that can be known. And so what that does is it shifts authority from an external source of truth really to myself. Yeah. And so that's what we see manifesting in culture. And that's really kind of its connection to its postmodern roots. So deconstruction is sort of like the vehicle you get in to leave historic Christianity. And then you can land in lots of different destinations. And one of those would be progressive Christianity. Now, progressive Christianity is sort of relevant to my story because the church that I shared about where this class happened, later, much later, after my husband and I left, rebranded itself as a progressive Christian community. And so what that did was send me on a journey to discover what is progressive Christianity, which what we're seeing is it's very similar to the theological liberalism that we saw emerge in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But there's this postmodern ethic about it. So not only is it going to be theologically liberal, meaning denying the miraculous stories in the Bible, diminishing the deity of Jesus, very much diminishing the authority of God's word, but also adding postmodern ethics to it. So as the culture shifts and changes on things like sexuality, abortion, these things progress for the progressive Christian. So they're going to be pretty much in lockstep with culture on these things, which is really interesting for topics that interest you. Yeah. Take, for example, the abortion debate. 10, 12 years ago, most people who identified as progressive Christian would have said they were pro-life. Yeah. And fast forward to, in the States, Roe v. Wade being overturned, there was just a collective mourning on progressive Twitter over that being overturned. So it was very interesting how quickly that even shifted as well. There's
an interesting thing about deconstruction is that a lot of people say they deconstruct because they want to strengthen their faith, that they want to get back to the basics. But from what I've observed, and your explanation is exactly the same that's happening in New Zealand culture, is that actually they move away from their faith. They move away from a traditional biblical understanding of Christianity, the Orthodox Christianity. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I think that's where the postmodern element becomes in, because it is a rethinking of your faith. And I do believe many people who enter into deconstruction probably are well-meaning. They're thinking, I want to get to a more authentic Christianity. Maybe they've had an experience of spiritual abuse, or maybe there's been hypocrisy that they've witnessed, and they want to move in the direction of something more authentic. But what ends up happening in the movement is that the beliefs are really assessed more by what you personally feel helped or harmed by, or what you feel is toxic versus liberating. That toxic theology is a big theme in deconstruction, where they're not really searching for what is true about theology, but what do I think is toxic? And I'm going to get rid of what I think is toxic. So what ends up being toxic are beliefs like human beings are inherently sinful. Jesus died a bloody death on the cross. Hell is a real place. Biblical marriage is between a man and a woman. Things like that get deemed toxic. And although the person might still identify as a Christian, they've rejected any meaningful definition of Christianity.
Yeah. I mean, as I've observed deconstruction and those that I've observed going through this, well, tell me if I'm correct here, my summation is that generally it's a rejection of biblical sexual ethics. that tends to be the driving force. So it's a progressive approach to LGBT issues especially. Sure, sometimes it's around critical theory and colonialism, and it's also around environmentalism. Rather than worshipping the God who created the environment, they want to worship the environment and climate alarmism. But on the whole, it tends to be around the sexuality issue. And I don't know, I'm just doing some rough surveying in my own head, but I would say 9 out of 10 people who have deconstructed is because they're rejecting the biblical sexual ethic. Am I right?
I think that's very fair. So in our research, we had to listen to countless deconstruction stories and read them, listen to their videos. And I cannot honestly recall even one where that issue doesn't at least play a part. I'm not, I'm not saying everybody who deconstructs comes out as gay or something like that, but that's always a thread. There's always either, they had friends and then they wanted to change their theology because of their friends, or even just one of the most famous deconstruction stories was Rhett McLaughlin of the Good Mythical Morning podcast and YouTube channel. There's a very famous deconstruction story where he's walking through what sounds like an intellectual rejection of Christianity, but at the end, he just kind of throws it out there. Oh, yeah, and Christianity oppresses gay people. And you think, oh, okay, so
that's what it's about.
That's the presupposition that's really leading to a lot of these intellectual, I think, rejections,
So do you think there's a good version of deconstructing?
I actually don't. And so I know many do. There are very many well-meaning evangelical leaders that would say it's okay to deconstruct, just do it in a healthy way. But I actually think that's a really dangerous way to talk about it personally, because if we tell young people, you can deconstruct, but just do it in a healthy way. And in that sense, what they're thinking about with deconstruction is more literal, like deconstructing a house and then building it back together. We want to encourage young people to ask hard questions and press hard on their faith and engage their doubts. Of course we do. But in our book, we just say, let's not call that deconstruction, because deconstruction has a meaning as how it manifests in culture. And it also has a postmodern background. Jacques Derrida was considered the father of deconstruction. Now, he was just applying it to words and text, but he didn't believe they had objective meaning. And so this gets applied to religion now, where religion doesn't have objective meaning. And so for these young kids that are thinking, okay, I can deconstruct in a healthy way, what's waiting for them online is a community of people that operates a lot like a cult. I get criticized for saying that, but it's very cultish the way that it operates, because there's a lot of propaganda, a lot of misinformation, and you're not getting the real facts. And so for a young kid who's just trying to, reevaluate their faith, they can get sucked into that and not be given the critical thinking skills to be able to navigate it.
So what's your warning for Christians in New Zealand around the deconstruction? They hear the term come out, they think, wow, that sounds like it's a good thing to do. There's some merit to it. What's your warning?
Yeah, well, I think that it's good and healthy to ask hard questions. It's good and healthy to engage your doubts and go on a search to try to resolve your doubts if you can, to press hard, to ask the hard questions. All of that is good. And we would say, yes, do that. But my warning would be, let's not call that deconstruction. Let's call that, in our book, we offer the word reformation. We should all be reforming our faith every single day. Every day we should be taking everything we hear and measuring that against Scripture. And then for some who maybe there are some serious doubts about Scripture, that's okay too. That's where apologetics comes in. You can research some evidence and information about biblical reliability and things like that. We still wouldn't call that deconstruction, because deconstruction really is a very specific thing. So my warning would be, let's resist using a trendy word, because it is very fashionable to want to deconstruct your faith. And in fact, I'll give myself as an example. In my first book, Another Gospel, I talked about my experience that I thought was a deconstruction. So in the book, you'll read that I deconstructed because I thought that's what had happened to me. It was the best word I had at the time because it was agonizing. It was years long. Everything was busted down to the studs and then built back up. And, lots of course corrections along the way. But when I started to talk about my deconstruction, deconstructionists would tell me, you didn't really deconstruct. You don't understand deconstruction if you think you deconstructed. And I would say, well, why is that?
Is that because you held on to traditional Christian
Exactly.
values?
They say, because you still believe toxic theology. So that's when I realized okay, there's something more going on here. So I don't use that word anymore. I actually correct myself in my deconstruction book. I say, that was the wrong word. I didn't realize it at the time. And so my warning would be, you know, you can reject the word. And even if you've used it before, you can say, you know what? That's not what I'm doing, you know, and I wouldn't recommend actual deconstruction because it's not based on truth. It's really based on personal preference.
Okay, well, we've covered 1D, deconstruction. As a woman, how can women and conservatives think that Donald Trump, a misogynist, a criminal, apparently, that you could vote for him? Why do conservatives think that Donald Trump could be a president?
Well, I think, you know, one of the reasons is because I'll just be honest with you about my journey. So I did not like him at all in the beginning. I remember seeing him at one of the early primaries thinking, is this a joke? Like, what? I mean, the way he was talking and everything, I couldn't believe it. I didn't vote for him. I just didn't vote for either one of the candidates we had that first time.
And is it actually, just while you say that, is it true that evangelical Christians are one of the worst groups for showing up to vote?
I don't know. That's a statistic I don't know.
I've heard about the get out the vote, and that part of the reason is that the evangelical Christian is pretty slack at voting.
Could be, could be. But so I didn't vote for him the first time. And yet I think the reason so many conservatives support him is because he kept a lot of his promises. And he had fairly good policies on a lot of issues that resonated with what, you know, when you look at the Bible, and it's sort of like we have to credit him with the overturn of Roe v. Wade, which is a huge victory for pro-life. And so I did vote for him the second time. Now, I've never seen evidence that he's a misogynist. I don't personally believe that he's a racist or misogynist like people say. I think that he's not a Christian. So I wouldn't expect him to behave like a Christian. I don't like a lot of the way he'll talk to and about people. But what I think people need to understand is that when you compare the two, I don't like that Donald Trump is soft now on abortion. In fact, he just tweeted, or it was on his other platform, that he's going to help preserve women's reproductive rights. And that's, you know, usually code for pro-abortion. And so it's terrible. But when you compare, I don't even see it like lesser of two evils. I'm just comparing our options, right? And you have one party that is advocating for radical abortion policies up to birth, transing of our kids, irreversible surgeries and medications on minors, which in my view is one of the greatest human rights violations of our modern time. And you have our open border, which is bringing tons of sex trafficking across the border, fentanyl, all sorts of crime and things. So you have that option, or you have an option that is not as strong on abortion as I would like. I would and I hope that Christians will press him to keep him accountable. But he is against the radical medical transitioning of young people. There's at least a more measured view of abortion. And so, and of course the border, which so much is happening at our border that is hurting people. And so I think, you know, to answer your question, how can conservatives do this? I think at this point, we're looking at both candidates like neither one of them is particularly godly. So you have to go with the policies. And so I think that's why so many conservatives are going, I think we have a better bet here, especially since he kept his promises the first time.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what I was going to ask is how do you reconcile of voting for Donald Trump when he, as a person, he's not a Christian. As a person, he, you know, there's not a lot to like in some ways, but do you think you can separate out the two? I actually asked Franklin Graham when he was in the country last year this exact same question, is that do we vote for the person or do we vote for the policy or do we try and hope that we can get both?
Well, I mean, I think we would hope we would have both, but if you don't have the option of both, then you have to go with what you have. Now, I personally don't think that he's, you know, the media has done a very good job of making him out to be a raving lunatic. I don't believe that's true about him. You know, I think there are some very good values that he holds to, things with family, with even certain lifestyle things. And then on the other hand, certain ones that is not at all. So,
He probably doesn't talk the way you want your kids to talk.
No,
in
no.
public.
And I hate the way he talks about people and to people.
Yeah.
But there are some things about him. And I have to say, with the assassination attempt, that was something that I think was very inspiring for a lot of people, his response to that, because his response to pop back up and with strength and is something you can't teach someone. It's something you can't practice. That's either in you or it's not. And I think that's what people are looking for in a leader.
Yeah.
So, of course, both very flawed people, but in my view, there's really no comparison. There's no comparison between the two when it comes to evil.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why many conservatives are drawn to vote for Donald Trump.
Right. And that leads us to the third one, which you touched on, which is Democrats. I mean, I still can't reconcile in my mind how a Christian can vote for the Democrats, given that they have such a staunch, strong, obsessive focus on death, on ending the unborn child's life up to full term. They're castrating and chemicalizing of children. I mean, some Christians must be voting for Democrats. How do they reconcile that?
I don't know. I like you, I'm very confused about that. I don't understand how that can be, because even just, I don't know if you saw this in your news over here, but the Democratic National Convention just happened this week. And Planned Parenthood had vans outside to offer free abortions and free vasectomies. Now, if you're the enemy of humanity, if you're the devil himself, you are going to go to try to end the creation mandate, be fruitful and multiply. Well, how do you do that? Vasectomies, and I'm just saying, vasectomies, abortions, and the sterilization of our children. And I don't understand how that could be the case. I've listened to certain people who call themselves evangelicals. There's this group in America called Evangelicals for Harris. Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, here's what I think. Now, I'm in New Zealand, so maybe I can be a little more
safe.
Free to give you my opinion. I might have to be more
This
careful.
is a free speech area.
Yes, I know. But, that Zoom call they had with the Evangelicals for Harris, many of the people on that Zoom call are progressive Christians that were on the progressive Christian call for Harris with John Pavlovitz. I mean, these are not what we would consider to be evangelicals. And these are not people that I've observed that have been willing to label themselves evangelicals until right now, when they can try to get the Christian vote for Evangelicals for Harris. So it seems very duplicitous, and it seems, now I'm not saying everybody who calls themselves a Christian and is going to vote for Democrats is duplicitous and disingenuous, but like you, it's very confusing. I haven't really heard someone that I would consider to be a biblical Christian give a case for voting for the Democrats, at least right now. That is compelling at all.
Any predictions for November?
Predictions?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. We'll have to see. God is in control. He's sovereign. If you would have asked me that the week following the Trump assassination, I would have thought it would be a landslide for him. But then he gets back to his old self, and
we're all being gaslit by the media that Biden was fully cogent and was able to be president. In fact, there was a poll that came out of just in New Zealand 2 days ago that found out that most New Zealanders favour Kamala Harris. If they were voting in the election, they would vote for Harris over Trump.
Well, that's probably, because you're getting...
And that's credit to the media.
And he's not wrong about Trump is not wrong about that. The media is overwhelmingly against him and for her. So everything you guys are probably seeing is not an accurate reflection of what's really going on. So it's I don't know.
The trust in media in New Zealand has plummeted. The surveys show that about a third of New Zealanders trust the media, which is an all-time low. Has it been that low in the United States for that long, or has it been more a recent trend?
I would say
since Trump came on the scene.
Yeah.
He called them out for fake news.
He broke everybody.
Proved him right.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, no, I think that most people don't trust the news. I don't know if you saw this. There was a an interview with Stephen Colbert, and who was he talking to?
To the CNN
That's right.
anchor.
And he said, well, we all know CNN is unbiased. And the audience burst out laughing.
The New York
audience. He was serious, but they thought he was being sarcastic because everybody knows how biased it is. So it's sort of like that George Orwell, 1984, don't believe your eyes, don't believe your ears. And the gaslighting is real. Yeah, it's a very interesting time to be alive as a Christian.
So deconstruction, Donald, Democrats are up to our fourth and last one, Demise of the culture. And look, it may be connected. Look, one of your books was Live Your Truth and Other Lies, exposing popular deceptions that make us anxious, exhausted, and self-obsessed. I mean, I just needed to read the cover and think, yeah, I like you. But look, we are raising a self-obsessed, narcissistic, hedonistic young generation that is stressed to the max.
Yes. Yeah.
Why is that? I know the answer, but you tell me.
Social media is a huge part of that.
Yeah.
The screen generation is very difficult as a parent to disciple kids through this, because even with their schoolwork, they have to have a screen for this stuff, and it's very daunting as a parent right now.
We actually had a report just come out this week saying that kids were turning up to school not being able to read and speak properly, and that they were spending too much time on screens. But of course they turn up to school and they're immediately doing work and homework on screens. And they just haven't quite made the connection.
Yeah, I guess so.
We actually had Jonathan Haidt speak at our conference last month, and I don't know if you've read his book.
I read The Coddling of the American
Yes, that was the first one, and this one is The Anxious Generation.
I need to read that.
Which is basically similar to what you're saying. So Live Your Truth and Other Lies. What's the premise of this book?
The premise is, so with my first book, Another Gospel, I was looking at the movement of progressive Christianity, but it was just purely theological. And so I was interacting with some of the more theologian and scholar types of progressive Christianity. But then I noticed that there were these high-level social media influencers who had millions of followers who were saying the same things as the progressive theologians, but they were saying it in much more catchy ways, and they were having a lot more interaction. So where the progressive theologian might say, we deny the doctrine of original sin, and we affirm original blessing, the social media influencer was saying, you're enough for yourself. And I realized they're saying the same things, and they're both sort of identifying as Christians, but it's a very anti-Christian message. And so there's slogans in there like, you're enough, God just wants you to be happy, you only live once, live your truth. What are some other ones? They're just kind of these slogans in culture that sound good. They sound like the thing you'd want to say to somebody who's struggling. But they really fail logically, but also biblically. And there's a lot of theology in that book, actually. We go to the Bible quite a bit.
So in terms of the demise of the culture, as you say, there's a very anti-life focus coming through in terms of even before you're born, but once you're born, the confusion, the changing the gender, the castration, sneaking children off to have abortions without parental knowledge, sneaking kids off to have puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones without parental knowledge. There is a wedge being driven in between parents and children by the state, isn't there? What's your message to parents in terms of that? What's your warning to them about what's going on?
Well, we have to stand up, because Marxism is always going to try to eliminate the family and try to isolate kids from their family. And so I think it's, I'm thinking a lot, I've never done this yet, but I think it's important for us to start thinking about going to board meetings, even if our kids aren't in the public schools. I just did a podcast with a man who's been very successful in removing some of the pornographic material out of the public schools in his area.
Right.
And so kind of giving people a template to follow to be able to be successful with that. I feel convicted that I've never really done that. But even if we don't have kids in the public schools, we need to advocate for kids. And so going to those PTA meetings and the board meetings and speaking up and saying we're not okay with this stuff is important. Taking control of our kids is important, and not letting. My friend has a T-shirt that says, "I don't co-parent with the government."
Yeah, it's great.
Have you seen that? Yeah. And so we can't be just obedient and compliant with these things. There is a time to disobey. And when the state oversteps, then we have to be practicing civil disobedience in certain ways. And sometimes that's going to cost us something. We're not used to that, but we have to be willing to pay that cost, I believe. And that's even just as Christians, just the small little compromises that we're tempted to make all the time lead to bigger ones. And we might as well just not make the small ones. And then let, the chips fall where they may.
Well, you've segued into my next question, which was about the cost of standing up for our faith. I mean, I think when we were young, I was younger a lot earlier before you were young, but in terms of the culture was sort of on, you could be a Christian in the culture and it was accepted. People went to church. Now it's becoming a bit more hostile. I liken it to the Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego in the fire. They're turning up the heat on the culture. Have you had to pay a cost? I mean, have you been cancelled, so to speak?
What I do is, I've been canceled. I mean, a little bit here. I've been uninvited to speaking events or ostracized from groups. Not a big deal, right? I haven't had to personally pay the same kind of cost that a teacher in a public school might have to pay. As somebody who makes content, YouTube can shadow ban me or they can, put a warning on my content or something like that. But my heart really goes out to the people who are working in the schools, who are working in regular jobs, who are being pressured. Like, you have to put your pronouns in your bio or you're going to lose your job.
The medical profession with abortion,
That's
euthanasia.
right, all that stuff. Yeah, and so I have much more compassion on the people that are navigating this in their everyday lives with their jobs. I do a job that's kind of, it's online. I can go speak and I can write books and I can get canceled by this person or that person, but it's not going to affect me all that much. I'm not like dependent on a larger organization for what I do. But for people who are, we have to count the cost. And I do expect that I won't have the platform that I have now for very much longer. I don't know, for however long the church, even the Christian church, is going to tolerate the church at large. And I think it's going to get smaller. And we're going to find ourselves in a much smaller pool as time goes on. But, small costs for me, nothing.
Has your family paid a cost?
I believe they have. Yeah, I believe they have. But there's been so many benefits too. God has been really faithful and good to us. My husband's full-time with me in the ministry. And so we've gotten to watch that grow together. But there's a social cost for sure. And the pressure gets turned up really high in some of the more difficult ideological battles, and people are just so mean. They just, they say horrible stuff, but I don't consider that persecution, sticks and stones, right? But for people, my friend Frank Turek wrote a book about biblical marriage, and he wasn't even in full-time in apologetics yet, but he got fired from 2 jobs simply because he wrote the book. But, I love to use that as an example because that is what God used to propel him into full-time ministry, which is what he does now. So we do, it's like in the Bible, if they go to prison, they'd do the prison ministry. They'd witness to the people in there. And we all, I think, as Christians have to have that mindset that no matter what the cost actually is, we have to be willing to pay it. And that gets tested with the small compromises.
Yeah. So I guess I'm circling just back to finish up with, back to the first area around progressivism and deconstructing of people's faith. Is there a connection? Has the demise of our culture been a natural consequence of the church losing its way and not speaking into I think it was Bonhoeffer said that the church is supposed to be the spoke in the wheels of the culture. Do you think that the church is losing its voice because of this push for progressivism? I mean, there is this new book out by Megan Basham talking about shepherds for sale. Yeah. And that is that the culture is more important than the scripture.
Well, what's interesting about her book is what she's really highlighted is something that many of us have observed over the past several years, but we just didn't have words for. I certainly didn't realize that some of these initiatives had, millions of dollars funneled in to Christian organizations from radical secular progressives, and not just like, hey, here's some money for your homeless ministry. These are initiatives that are specifically meant to change the church's mind on things like sexuality, critical race theory, environmentalism, all sorts of different progressive talking points. And they've been successful even in our evangelical culture, where people are otherwise theologically conservative. We've started to see our leaders start talking, taking on the language of Black Lives Matter and critical theory and all of these things. And we're kind of scratching our heads going, where is this coming from? And I think what Megan has put her finger on is that even not every pastor who adopted those talking points is bought, right? But it's flowed down from the ones who have been bought.
Yeah.
And then the people that you trusted as your leaders are saying these things. Well, then you start saying these things and it all trickles out into culture. And so I think she's done a very important work, sort of blowing the lid off of all of that, which is important.
Okay. We need to release you back into the conference. Just one last question. What's your message for people who love the church, who love Scripture, but can see the culture going down the toilet, but are also concerned that the church is also losing its way?
Yeah.
What can these people do?
Well, I think we can stand and pray, right? We can refuse to give in to the compromise. And I think there's going to be a bit of reshifting as we we might have to change churches. We might have to find a different community. But we have the promise of Scripture knowing that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. The church will stand. It's all going to be fine. It's all going to be okay. And it's honestly an exciting time to be alive, because it's no longer easy to be a real Christian in America anymore, which is, for 200 years, we've kind of coasted a little bit where it's not been that difficult to be a Christian. And now it is. And so we get to join with many saints who have gone before us and have to pay a cost for what we believe. And so that's an exciting time to be alive.
Well, Lisa, thank you for your work. We'll highlight the books that you've written, because I think people do need to read them and understand some of these issues. Thank you for coming to New Zealand. Glad you got to see Rotorua and Queenstown and Hobbiton and Auckland, and hope to get you back here at some stage. And thank your family and your husband for allowing you to be here. Because it's so important for New Zealanders to hear. We say that it's an American issue, but it's part of the Western culture, isn't it?
That's right.
And so it's all part of our issue as well. Thanks, Alisa.
Oh, thank you.